For 3 centuries, the story seemed simple. A handful of French settlers crossed the Atlantic, planted their flag along the St. Lawrence River, and built a nation that would carry their blood, their language, and their identity forward into millions of descendants. That story has a name in Quebec, pure laine, meaning pure wool, pure stock, unbroken lineage back to France. But new genetic evidence, pulled from one of the largest population databases on Earth, has started to unravel a thread nobody expected to find. And once you see what's underneath, the whole fabric looks different. The traditional account goes like this. Between 1608 and around 1760, roughly 10,000 colonists left France for what was then called New France. Most came from a tight cluster of regions, Normandy, Perche, the area around Poitou. They married among themselves. They multiplied fast, families of 10, 12, sometimes 15 children, in a colony where land was cheap and the Catholic Church encouraged growth. Historians have long treated this as one of the cleanest examples of a founder population in human history. A small, homogeneous group whose descendants, through sheer isolation and repeated intermarriage, would eventually number in the millions, spreading not just across Quebec, but into New England, Louisiana, and beyond. For decades, that homogeneity was treated almost as fact. Geneticists even used French Canadians as a textbook case for studying founder effects, the way rare genetic diseases can spike in frequency when a population descends from a small, closed group of ancestors. Certain hereditary conditions, some barely seen anywhere else in the world, show up in Quebec at rates dozens of times higher than the global average. On the surface, this seemed to confirm everything. A tiny, isolated gene pool, sealed off, repeating itself generation after generation. But here is where the story starts to wobble. When researchers began sequencing DNA from thousands of Quebec residents, cross-referencing it against BALSAC, a genealogical database stretching back over 400 years and linking millions of church records, the picture that emerged wasn't as tidy as the textbook suggested. The genetic signatures weren't uniformly French in the way anyone expected. Some lineages carried echoes from regions nobody had accounted for. Others showed patterns of ancestry that shouldn't have existed if the population had truly stayed as closed as historians assumed. And then came a detail that quietly changed everything. Traces of ancestry that weren't European at all. Not a footnote, not a rounding error. A real, measurable signal present in modern French-Canadian genomes, pointing towards something the pure laine story had never made room for. Something that had been present from the earliest generations of the colony, and had been either overlooked, misunderstood, or deliberately left out of the official narrative for a very long time. To understand what that signal actually means, we have to go back to the beginning. Not to the myth of the pure settlers, but to the ships, the parish records, and the women whose names rarely made it into the history books at all. The ships that crossed to New France did not carry equal numbers of men and women. Far from it. For decades, colonists were overwhelmingly male, soldiers, fur traders, laborers sent to secure territory and extract resources from a land the French crown barely understood. A colony cannot grow on soldiers alone, and by the 1660s, officials in Paris recognized the problem. Their solution became one of the most studied migrations in Canadian history. The Filles du Roi, the King's Daughters, roughly 800 women sent to New France with dowries funded by the state, intended to marry, settle, and populate the colony as quickly as possible. Genealogists have long known that a striking percentage of today's French Canadians can trace a line back to these women. What genetic analysis has added is something subtler and stranger, because the further researchers pushed into the maternal lines, using mitochondrial DNA passed unbroken from mother to daughter, the less purely French some of those lines appeared to be. Some maternal lineages traced back not to Normandy or Perche, but to ancestry with no clear European origin at all. Patterns consistent with indigenous North American maternal lines, embedded quietly within family trees that had, for generations, been recorded on paper as entirely French. This is where the mystery deepens rather than resolves. because the written record, baptismal certificates, marriage registers, the backbone of BALSAC itself, rarely mentioned this ancestry directly. Colonial society had strong incentives to record marriages and children as unambiguously French and Catholic, regardless of who a woman's mother or grandmother actually was. Mixed unions between French settlers and indigenous women were not rare in the earliest, most male-heavy years of the colony, particularly among fur traders and those living closest to indigenous communities along the St. Lawrence and further into the interior. Historians have known of these unions in isolated cases for a long time. What DNA analysis reveals is different. Not isolated cases, but a persistent, measurable signal running through modern populations. Evidence that this mixing wasn't a rare exception quietly erased by time, but a foundational thread woven into the colony from its earliest, least documented decades. Which raises an uncomfortable question the paper records alone could never answer. If the official story of pure French descent was incomplete from the very beginning, who exactly decided what counted as French and what got left out of the story on purpose? The answer, it turns out, has less to do with biology and more to do with power. In the 18th and 19th centuries, being classified as French in Quebec was not just an ethnic label. It was a legal and social boundary. Indigenous ancestry, once acknowledged openly in the earliest colonial records, gradually became something families had reason to obscure. As colonial and later Canadian policy grew increasingly restrictive toward Indigenous peoples, controlling land rights, status, and legal recognition, having Indigenous ancestry carried real consequences. Over generations, some families quietly shifted how they identified and how priests and clerks recorded them, moving from mixed origins toward a simplified, uniformly French-Canadian identity that carried none of those risks. This is not speculation. It is a pattern historians have documented in family histories across Quebec, Acadia, and the broader Métis world of the Great Lakes and the prairies. Communities descended from exactly this kind of early mixing between French traders and Indigenous women, who developed their own distinct culture, language, and identity separate from both European and Indigenous societies. For a long time, this Métis heritage was treated as a story confined to the West, to the Red River and the fur trade routes far beyond Quebec's borders. But the genetic data complicates even that boundary. If Indigenous maternal ancestry shows up consistently within Quebec's core, pure laine population, not just among communities that always identified as Métis, but embedded within families who considered themselves, and were considered by others, simply French-Canadian, then the line separating these two identities was never as fixed as either history books or family tree suggested. It was, in part, a line drawn later, retroactively, shaped by which ancestry was safe to acknowledge and which was safer to forget. None of this erases the very real, very well-documented European core of French-Canadian ancestry. The overwhelming majority of genetic material in most Quebec genomes still traces back to those original French regions, Normandy, Perche, Poitou, exactly as the historical record describes. This isn't a story of a hidden population secretly replacing another. It's something more delicate, a founding population that was, from its very first generations, more genetically blended than the identity built on top of it ever admitted. Which leaves one final question hanging over everything uncovered so far. Not whether this mixing happened, because the DNA settles that. The real question is what it means for the millions of people today who grew up believing their ancestry was singular, unbroken, and entirely European. That question is being answered right now, in real time, by people who never expected DNA testing to rewrite their family story. Across Quebec, genealogists and geneticists working with projects like BALSAC have started returning results to descendants that complicate generations of assumed identity. Some families already knew, quietly, of an Indigenous great-great-grandmother mentioned once and never again. Others had no idea at all. Their family trees, carefully kept for 200 years, had simply never recorded her. The DNA doesn't lie the way a baptismal register sometimes did. It carries the signal forward regardless of what was written down or left out by a priest working under the social pressures of his time. This is the real answer to what the title promised. French Canadians were never quite who the pure laine story claimed. Not because their French ancestry is in question, but because that ancestry was never as isolated, as sealed off, as the founding myth required it to be. From its earliest, most fragile decades, the colony along the St. Lawrence was already a place of contact, of mixing, of women whose names and origins were quietly folded into a simpler narrative that history found easier to tell. Modern genetics hasn't demolished French-Canadian identity. It has done something more interesting. It has restored a missing chapter to it. It has given voice, through mitochondrial DNA passed silently down maternal lines for over 300 years, to the Indigenous women whose presence shaped a nation's founding population, but whose names rarely survived in the archives built by the people who married them. That absence in the written record was never proof of absence in reality. It was a choice, made generation after generation, about which ancestors were safe to remember and which were easier to forget. Today, as more descendants trace their own genomes back through these tangled, blended lines, the story being uncovered isn't a rupture with the past. It's a correction to it. A reminder that identity, especially one built across centuries and continents, is rarely as pure or as simple as the story a nation chooses to tell about itself. Somewhere in nearly every French-Canadian genome tested, there's a signature of a woman whose name history forgot, but whose ancestry, quietly, never did.